Good day. Over the last couple of hours, there have been fewer reports from the Ukrainian battlefronts, other than the fact that the Russians have been carrying out very dense and heavy missile, artillery, and airstrikes all across the line of contact. But there's been little information about actual movements, actual advances on the fighting lines themselves. I say that, though just a very short time ago, the following report appeared on Redovka. Redovka, as I've said many times, is a Russian newspaper published in Smolensk. It has very strong pro-war positions. It nonetheless has a large number of reporters on the ground, and it is, in fact, in my opinion, an important site in order to try to get an overall view of what's going on in the fighting. Anyway, this report from Redovka, which is a few hours old, claims that Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut has now collapsed and that the Ukrainians are trying to withdraw from Bakhmut and that, in effect, the town is about to pass fully under Russian control. I'll just read it briefly. Armed forces of Ukraine are trying to break through to the defense line near Chasov Yar. Bakhmut has passed under the full control of the fighters of the Wagner organization. A source from Redovka reports that the armed forces of Ukraine are destroying abandoned equipment. Part of the personnel retreats to the Chasov Yar defense line, but is suffering heavy losses. Artillery is active at the moment. The head of the Wagner organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has not yet confirmed the information about the complete control over the city. Some Ukrainian fighters still remain within the settlement and are trying to get to western positions. Now, that's from Redovka. It's an isolated report at the moment, but it is consistent with the trend of the fighting over the last couple of days and indeed the last couple of hours. Yesterday, I said that the British Defense Ministry has now admitted a crisis for the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, and we have had further reports since then over the last few hours of Russian forces, the Wagner organization forces, continuing to make progress in western Bakhmut. Prigozhin did release a report saying that fighting was still going on there, that Ukrainian troops were still resisting. But since that comment of Prigozhin's, we've had this further report from Redovka, which suggests an attempt by Ukraine to pull its troops out of Bakhmut, retreat to Chasov Yar, but that this is in some ways a disorganized retreat, and as I've discussed many times, it's coming up very much, it's having to take place very much under the fire of the Russian guns. There were also reports earlier, by the way, which claimed that the Russians have actually cut the road from Ivanivska to Bakhmut itself, and if that is indeed the case, and I want to stress these are all unconfirmed reports at the moment, then it does look as if we're now in the final hours of this battle. Having said this, I want to stress again, these are unconfirmed reports at the moment. Quite likely, by the time you see these, watch this program, we'll have a clearer idea of what the situation in Bakhmut actually is, and then, of course, you get a further update tomorrow from me, and we'll look at the situation with more clarity then. In the meantime, everybody continues to talk about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, I want to just say that I've now had an opportunity to review some of these documents, this document dump, which has suddenly appeared, and I've come to the conclusion that these are indeed real documents and that they do originate with information provided by Ukraine itself, coordinated with NATO as well. Now, some sources have commented about these documents and suggested that they're fakes. They've suggested that the losses suffered by the Russians attributed to these documents are far too high, and that they correlate exactly with those of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. And they've also pointed out that these documents abruptly and without explanation increased the totality of Ukrainian losses killed in action from 16,000 to 65 to 70,000, and that these reports also provide information about Russian positions, Russian formations, deployments in Ukraine, which can be easily accessed from open sources. I don't think any of these arguments are compelling. Firstly, if the information does originate from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, then one would expect claims of Russian losses to correspond with those previously made by the Russian Ministry of Defense. That seems to me to be obvious. The fact that there's been a sudden multiplication of Ukrainian losses from 16,000 to 65,000 to 70,000, for the record, I don't take seriously either of these figures. Again, I suspect is a response to some queries from the Western side about whether Ukrainian losses were indeed as low as the 16,000 that Ukraine was claiming. And again, I suspect that it's, again, the Ukrainians themselves who provided updated information about their losses, which I suspect is still too low. And the fact that the information about Russian troop deployments can be obtained from open sources doesn't mean that these aren't actual Ukrainian documents. It just further confirms that despite all the various claims about massive minute observation of the Russians by satellites, all kinds of other things, that the Russian military has been actually quite successful in keeping its secrets. So I just wanted to say that I think these are genuine documents, and what they do show, to my mind, to my way of thinking, is that certainly as of the 1st of March, Ukraine was still far from ready, getting its forces ready to launch this offensive. There was still a lot of deploying and troop build-ups to do. There's certain aspects of these Ukrainian formations that have invited some puzzlement. It's caused some uncertainty, for example, why Ukraine would concentrate all its infantry fighting vehicles, its Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, in a formation that lacks tanks and things of that kind. I'm not going to get into the details of that. I just think that overall this does give a fairly good sense of Ukrainian preparations for the counteroffensive as of the 1st of March. It does seem as if Ukraine has prepared somewhere in the region of 9 brigades for this offensive. Now, on the face of it, that looks like a powerful force, but it's been suggested that we're talking about something like 45,000 men, which may not be anywhere near enough for an advance on multiple directions if, these reports are indeed accurate, as they say they are. Incidentally, the Institute for the Study of War, this Washington-based think tank, very closely connected to the US military-industrial complex, and as far as I can see, published or produced by members of the Kagan-Nuland family, to a great extent at least, has said that this is going to be the biggest mobilization and build-up since the Second World War. On the strength of these documents, I would have said that that was probably not the case. It doesn't seem to me as if Ukrainian forces are anything like as strong as the Institute for the Study of War is saying. And I do wonder whether the Institute for the Study of War might have rushed out publication of that claim. It's obviously based on longer term analysis and study, but whether they might have rushed out this claim to try to offset to some degree the effect of the publication of these documents. This is just a guess, by the way. Anyway, it's absolutely clear to me also where the pressure for this offensive, the spring offensive by Ukraine, is coming from. We've had further comments from Secretary of State Blinken. He's again saying that a ceasefire would be an extremely bad idea. He clearly will not give up on his offensive. He wants this offensive to happen. He's pushing Ukraine into launching this offensive. I have to say, and I think people perhaps ought to take this fact into account, these statements by US officials, by Austin, and especially by Blinken, saying that there's going to be an offensive, saying that Ukraine has all the prospects of succeeding in this offensive, that the Russian forces are depleted and unable to carry on the fight and all that kind of thing. To me, these look like public pressure upon Ukraine to launch this offensive. In fact, I would go further. I would say that they're almost instructions to Ukraine to launch this offensive. How are the Ukrainians? Let's assume that they do an assessment of the situation on the battlefields, which for all I know they have done, an objective assessment, and would decide that this offensive was a bad idea. How could they come round and say now that this offensive will not be launched after their key paymaster and arms supplier, the US administration, has come out with the kind of statements that Blinken is making? So I think people need to understand that, and there's been a lot of discussion about US involvement in Ukrainian military planning. Well, we don't have to speculate about that. We don't have to look and sift through the information to establish that this is the case, because these public statements by Blinken and others, Austin especially, make the fact obvious. Now, there have been a series of comments by all kinds of Russian officials commenting both about the document leak and about the prospects of the Ukrainian offensive. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has come out and said that the document leak will certainly be taken into account by the Russian General Staff as they prepare as they can carry out their own planning. And of that, of course, I have no doubt. That is, of course, always assuming that it wasn't Russian intelligence which got hold of these documents, perhaps through a hack, perhaps through agents in Kiev, maybe, or Brussels, who knows? If it wasn't Russian intelligence that is responsible for this leak in the first place, I can't imagine anything more demoralizing to Ukrainian commanders than knowledge of the fact that the Russians not only know that there's going to be an offensive, but have details of their logistic arrangements and of their plans. That's the first thing. That was the first comment. That was from Peskov. Yan Gagin, Pushilin's advisor, has come out and said that if the Ukrainians do launch an offensive, they will suffer colossal losses, especially in the first days, and irrecoverable losses, especially in the first days. Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, whose the Chechen forces in the Russian military that are participating in this operation are said to number around 9,000, and that's a steady number since the start of the conflict. Kadyrov has said that he's looking forward to this offensive, that it will enable the Russians not only to break the Ukrainian military, but also to capture large numbers of prisoners and also large numbers of trophy weapons. And I read another report somewhere that the Russians expect that something like 70% of the equipment that Ukraine will use in this offensive is likely to be destroyed. Well, whether or not all that's true, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's what the Russians are saying. For the record, the most interesting, for me, explanation or view of this offensive comes from Vladimir Rogov, who is the head of the, one of the people involved in the Zaporozhye, the Russian-backed Zaporozhye government. And he's made a number of really interesting comments on Russian television on Solovyov Live. He says, "We have prepared several deeply layered defense lines, beginning with the banal dragon's teeth, as they're called by people, cone-shaped structures intended to halt the advance of tanks when these tanks are bombarded by our artillery, our air force, multiple rocket launch systems, and so on. The same refers to minefields. Our troops are ready. They know the front line, the Zaporozhye direction, and understand well what to do." And then he went on to say that all the talk about the Zaporozhye direction being a weak link in the Russian defense lines may stem from local terrain features. Plains and continuous steppe are nowhere to find a natural barrier. There would exist certain possibilities for the quick advance of armor or an armored force if the defense lines were not normal, were not organized properly. But that is not the case, and this will certainly not be an easy ride for the enemy. So Rogov appears to say that the Russians have their defenses organized in Zaporozhye. They've made up for the lack of obvious defensive barriers, natural defensive barriers, by constructing these enormous fortified lines, and they're ready. They're ready for whatever the Ukrainians throw at them, and they know what to do. I would add that way back at the time of the Kherson counteroffensive, it was actually suggested that the fact that we're talking about open steppe land would actually work in a case like this to the advantage of the defenders, because it would mean that the attacking force would not be able to conceal itself behind natural formations like hills and such things, and that it would make it easier for artillery and aircraft to pick out knockout tanks and armoured vehicles and that sort of thing. And my recollection of the fighting over the course of the Kherson counteroffensive strongly suggested that that was probably the truth. So I just want to say that it may be that the landscape is not quite as beneficial to the defence, especially a defence lacking artillery, as some people perhaps imagine. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about all of these preparations. Now, perhaps because the British Ministry of Defence has said that the has basically was talking yesterday about what looked like the imminent fall of Bakhmut. Today, they're talking about the failure of the Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy system. Well, the Ukrainian energy system is in fact still up and running, and in fact Ukraine says that it's going to resume electricity exports. However, my sense is that it has been very, very badly knocked about, and one of the reasons why energy exports have resumed is because energy consumption in Ukraine has almost certainly sharply fallen because of the enormous damage that's been done to Ukrainian industry. My own personal view about the attacks on the energy system, and here I'm going to say it's contrary to my own assessments at the time. My own view was that it was not intended to knock it out entirely. John Helmer made a suggestion at one point, which I still think might very well be a valid one, that the Russians were launching